I am just so excited that we have such a knowledgeable person and such an important person in our community to talk to us this morning. Her name is Zoë Heitzinger, and she's the Prevention Outreach Manager for the Domestic Abuse Intervention Services in Madison, Wisconsin. And that's known as DAYS, D-A-I-S, DAYS. So since 1977, DAYS has worked passionately and effectively to ensure the safety and well-being of domestic violence survivors and their families, and to attempt to change societal attitudes that perpetuate violence and the abuse of power. Zoë received her master's in social work in 2019. She found a passion for DAYS, and her job there is really entails advocacy, outreach, and education. She runs something called the Men's Encouraging Nonviolent Strategies, or the Men's Club, with middle and high school male-identified youth to really support this population to end gender-based violence while also having a safe place to talk about growing up male and forming healthy male identity. Zoë gives presentations to a wide variety of group and diverse audiences, work sites, faith-based organizations, schools, all kinds of different topics related to domestic and intimate partner violence. It's a heavy topic. It's an important topic. It's something that we thought was really appropriate for our all-department conference. So we have faculty, we have what we call advanced practice providers, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, and we have many of our administrative staff who are here with us today. So let's give a round of applause to Zoë. I'll welcome her to the podium. And we really appreciate you being here.
All right, good morning, everybody. Oh, I love it. I've been presenting to middle schoolers all week long and saying good morning, and you get like a cricket in the room. So thank you all. I always like to start off with just a mention of some gratitude and appreciation. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for being interested in this topic as well, too. I was talking to Christy before we started that in the past year and a half, I have been reached out to by so many doctors, nurses, advanced practitioners, whoever it might be, to learn about this topic. And just know that it warms my heart every time to know that you are all here in this space with me today to learn about this. And please know too that I welcome all questions, any questions, and if at any point, if you want to stop me to ask those questions, please do so. You do not need to feel like you have to wait in any way or wait until the end. But once again, my name is Zoë Heitzinger. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Prevention Outreach Manager at Domestic Abuse Intervention Services. Before I jump into kind of the meat or the content of my presentation today, I always just bring in some kind of guidelines or parameters into every space that I present in, and grounding it in safety as well too. So number one being safety for self. In whatever way you have a relationship to this topic, or if this is the first time that you're hearing kind of the big overarching ins and outs of this topic, I want to make sure that you're considering your safety the most and at the forefront of the conversation today. So if at any point, if you need to step out, if you need to look at your phone, I know I scroll sometimes when I just need a moment to check out, or if you need to leave, take a walk, get some fresh air, whatever you need to do to keep yourself safe in this space, I encourage you to do that. Second, safety for others. We know that Madison is one of the biggest small towns to ever exist. So if we are asking any questions today or sharing any wisdom or anecdotes, I just want to make the note to please not share any identifying information about a person, about a place, just because we, again, don't know who might know each other in this space today. And then lastly, I want to make the note about gendered language is that the common narrative that exists around domestic violence is female victim and male perpetrator. But that is not the only relationship to exist. Trans people can experience domestic violence, non-binary people, men. So in this conversation today, specifically with like a resource such as the Power and Control Wheel that is very gendered, that paints female victim, male perpetrator, I will be changing those pronouns to reflect they, them, just to bring in as many experiences into the conversation as possible. So for example, on the Power and Control Wheel, it might say something like controlling what she does. I'm just going to change that to say controlling what they do, just to bring in, again, as many experiences as possible. All right, I'm going to give us a rundown of day services before we jump into anything else because we do a ton at my organization. So once again, DAYS is Domestic Abuse Intervention Services. All of our services are free and confidential to the community. There is no cost. And then the confidentiality piece basically means that anybody who reaches out to us, uses our services, or just calls our helpline, we will never share that information with anybody else. So to kick it off too, 24-hour helpline and our 24-hour text line are our most used services and the gateway to all of the other services on this list. The 24-hour helpline and the text line are both answered by real people, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we don't triage in with like a national hotline at all. It is local, it is real people who are staffed on both of those lines 24 hours a day. If somebody texts us, this is a fairly new program of ours. If somebody sends us a text message, they will get 2 texts immediately. The first text will say, you know, if this is an emergency, to please call 911. Days is not emergency services. And the second text says that an advocate will be with you within 15 minutes. If nobody has texted back within 15 minutes, text us again. We will never text somebody first, just making sure we're considering safety. That say, you know, somebody has a moment when their partner steps out to walk the dog and they want to text us, they want to have a moment of advocacy or emotional support. We don't know within that 15 minutes if the partner will come back or have access to seeing their device. So we would never text somebody first. So again, if nobody has texted back, just text us again. We also offer case management services both to clients living in our shelter and to community case management clients as well too. We can go literally physically meet somebody where they are at if they would like, you know, mobile advocacy. We also have support groups that happen twice a week on Thursday evenings and Friday afternoons. And all of the information on support group is on our website, which is www.abuseintervention.org. We also have a legal advocacy department, and this is one of my favorite departments that we have. We can provide in-person support during criminal, family, and civil court cases as well. We can also help with restraining orders, no contact orders, and we can just generally help walk somebody through the legal process as well too. One of the most, and excuse my language on this, but one of the most badass programs that we have at Days is in the legal advocacy department, and that is called our Court Watch program. We send volunteers on our end into those courtroom settings, and we rate and code the judges in that space. And at the end of the year, we compile all of our findings into one big document called the Court Watch report, where we give suggestions or like anecdotes, any information that we gather on our end to best make the courtroom setting a trauma-informed space for survivors. And why I say it's badass is because they listen to us, which is really cool. We present that to the judges, the DA's office, and the court commissioners as well too. And it's really great to elicit feedback from those judges too, who might have not received the best feedback from us. But you know, to have that conversation just around that, again, the overall goal of making that courtroom a safe space for somebody. We also have a parent, child, and youth advocacy program at Days too. This helps with the parents of kiddos living in shelter and the kiddos living in our shelter as well too. We have a part of our building that is called Kids Space that can accommodate kind of that birth to 3, elementary, middle, and then we have a teen room as well too. And that programming can happen every night, or as long as there are kids in our shelter, we will have a place for them to go. It gives the parents a break who are living in our shelter, and it also gives the kids, you know, a break from their parents too. So the most fun one that we did recently, actually last week, is we hosted a fake prom for the kiddos where they dressed up in hilariously large like suit jackets and dresses, and we had glow sticks, and it was a beautiful, like really fun evening for them. Then that brings me to our shelter. We are the only domestic violence shelter in Dane County. We are not a homeless shelter. We are what's called an emergency homicide prevention shelter. So we are attempting to house those in our community who are experiencing the most lethal or near lethal forms of violence. In order to get connected to our shelter, it's a 2-part assessment process. So somebody calls us and says, hey, I want to come in for shelter. We do a lethality risk assessment screening right there on the phone with them. And then the second part of the assessment is a follow-up that can last anywhere from 45 minutes to 3 hours, depending on the level of detail someone wants to share with us. And that can be done at Days, that can be done at a safe location for them, or that second part can also be done over the phone as well. We have 60 beds and a 90-day shelter stay. And if at the end of that shelter stay, if somebody is not returning to their community in a safe place, we can absolutely extend that as much as somebody would need to. We also run on a wait list, but our wait list is not first come, first serve. It's based upon that lethality risk assessment screening. But say somebody is in a highly dangerous situation and we do not have space in our shelter, we do have hotel and motel vouchers available for whatever might be the safest option for somebody as well. And then lastly, that brings me to my job, primary prevention and outreach and education. We are called the POET department, Prevention, Outreach, Education, and Training. I love an acronym. And in my department, That primary prevention program is the men's club work that I do. So that is a year-long program for middle and high school male identified youth. They are with me for about 50 minutes to an hour of their school day. And we talk about healthy relationships, healthy masculinity, what it looks like to grow up as male in 2024, and just kind of the ins and outs of what they're seeing right now from media, from the news, from their social groups, whatever it might be. And it's the best part about my job. We are at East High School, La Follette High School, Memorial High School, Monona Grove High School, and then Blackhawk, Sherman, and Whitehorse Middle Schools as well. I have big dreams of infiltrating all of MMSD at some point. But until then, those are our sites that we have right now. And then outreach and education is when I do this for groups like you all. So thank you once again. Any questions on my services before I move on? Cool. So just to briefly touch on some terminology around domestic violence and intimate partner violence, I have been using the two of these pretty interchangeably throughout this presentation, but there is a slight difference in them. Domestic violence, domestic abuse is the most common, term that we hear, and it's also the legal terminology for what the crime is, referring to two people or two partners in a home setting. Domestic violence, however, can cover potential child abuse or neglect happening in a home or issues of roommate to roommate violence as well. But at Days, we are an intimate partner violence organization, so a current or former intimate partner. And this most accurately, reflects the clients that we serve because we are a victim services agency. And so when I say that we do not treat perpetrators, we do not have programs for perpetrators, we are only a victim services agency. We can help refer people to the programs that exist in our community, to services or programs for perpetrators, but at Days, we serve intimate partner violence victims. And then lastly, I always just make the note on victim versus survivor. Again, you will hear me use these interchangeably throughout this presentation, but I just always like to make the note that some people might not be ready or might not want to identify as either victim or survivor. So I always just default sometimes then to the person who experienced violence as that term. Any questions? So this is the definition that we operate under at Days on what intimate partner violence is. Intimate partner violence is the intentional use of power and control tactics by one intimate partner over the other in order to create an environment of fear and intimidation. And I have those words bolded for a reason. At its core, domestic violence is a choice that somebody is making. It's intentional. It's on purpose. I always get a couple looks and some pushback when I mention that. And I always like to bring up the three myths that exist around domestic violence. One is that it is caused by substance use. Two, that it's caused by a mental health diagnosis or disorder. And three, that it is caused by anger management. All three of those things are false. If I take the first one, substance use, somebody could be dealing with a substance use disorder such as alcoholism, right? And maybe when that person drinks, maybe they become more violent to their partner, or maybe it's just a not safe situation at home. But that person could absolutely go to AA, right? They could go to Alcoholics Anonymous. They could learn how to cope with their substance. They could stop using that substance altogether. But just because that substance use stops does not mean the violence on their partner also stops at home. It might mean that those episodes are less violent. It might mean that they are less frequent, but it might also just mean that maybe some things like physical violence stops, but emotional violence keeps going, or financial violence is still there, or those power and control tactics that we will get into in just a second here. But it's ultimately not the cause of what is happening, right? Same thing with the mental health diagnosis or disorder. We don't ever want to further stigmatize folks by thinking that if somebody is experiencing a mental health diagnosis or disorder, that they're inherently abusive, or that if somebody is abusive, they're inherently dealing with a mental health diagnosis or disorder. There's not a correlation between those two. However, there is space in the conversation if somebody's diagnosis does lend them to have, maybe violent mood swings at times. But again, it's not the ultimate cause of the domestic violence happening. And then lastly, just to mention it, anger management as well too. Somebody could go to anger management classes. They could learn how to cope with their anger. They could also learn how to mask their anger as well too. So that might mean that they're less angry to the Quick Trip cashier or on the road when they're driving, but it does not mean that they're less angry to their partner. That's not ultimately what that means. And I also want to make the note too, I mentioned this at the beginning, but domestic violence occurs in all populations, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, education status, religious beliefs, geography, or ability or disability. There's not a population that can't experience this. Anybody could potentially experience it. And I always bring this quote in when I talk with doctors, nurses, or anybody in the healthcare field, because I think it does a really great job kind of talking about what a person's experience can feel like in that setting. So it says, I had been admitted into hospitals and visited emergency rooms many times. Each time I was terrified that someone would ask me how I got my injuries, and I was just as terrified that they wouldn't, and I would have to go home and continue to deal with this all on my own. And I bring this into this space because you all hold a very unique role in helping intimate partner violence victims and survivors. That space in a clinic, that space in the room with a patient, that space when you meet them at the front desk, whatever that might look like, might be that first time that somebody is saying, I have been victimized by this type of violence. Or it might be that first point of safety for them for like the couple of years or the couple of months or the couple of weeks or even the couple of days that they've been experiencing some type of violence. So you all hold a very special and a very unique role in this. And when we talk about intimate partner violence, I talk about it as a public health crisis. We are experiencing right now in 2024 the highest rates that we have ever seen of intimate partner violence for our society. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the United States will be a victim of severe physical violence during their lifetime. And I want to talk about men for a quick second. That number for men in 2020 was 1 in 10. In 2022, it was 1 in 7. We are now at 1 in 4 men. That doesn't mean that more men are being abused. It means that more men are coming forward to report the abuse that is happening to them. And now men are starting to see themselves reflected more accurately in the movement to end domestic violence. And again, a lot of this data is self-reported data, so I just wanted to make that as a caveat. But that number goes up exponentially for our trans community. That number is 1 in 2 for trans people, and it's a 54% chance that somebody who is trans will experience severe physical violence or near lethal domestic violence in their lifetime. Most cases of domestic violence are never reported to the police. If anything, domestic violence is one of, if not the most, underreported crime that exists. And when we talk about some barriers, there are reasons for that, right? Number one being that the most common system or sector that takes in this data is the legal or law enforcement system, right? And somebody who's experiencing domestic violence might not feel comfortable reaching out to the police. They might not be ready to reach out to the police. So that's why it might be, or why it is, I should say, one of the most underreported crimes. More than 33% of women treated in emergency rooms were hurt by their intimate partner, but fewer than 5% are identified as domestic violence victims. And this is because domestic violence can manifest or look like a bunch of different things, right? It could manifest as a chronic health issue. It could manifest as, a broken arm, right? But if somebody is not fully disclosing in that moment, it might not be that direct correlation. Also, survivors of physical abuse are more likely to suffer multiple health symptoms and chronic health problems, as I mentioned. Less than 20% of DV victims seek medical treatment after being hurt by an intimate partner, and that has to do always with power and control. And a lot of times it has to do with minimizing what that issue is, or maybe how severe that injury might be as well. 92% of intimate partner violence victims did not talk about DV with their physicians, and 57% don't tell anyone. This also relates to that, underreported crime as well too, and it just being underreported in general. But I know that these numbers have gone up. That 92% with the 57% statistic here does come from about 10 years ago. So I know that number has changed slightly. And lastly, why I call it a public health crisis is that intimate partner violence costs our country, the United States, more than $9.3 billion a year. That is medical visits, mental health visits, that's operating programs and shelters like mine. But it is a really big price tag for our country that domestic violence carries. So with that alone, it is a public health crisis. And to look at Madison or kind of Dane County, our area, of the 284,000 women in Dane County, over 94,500, have been or will be victims of DV in their lifetime. And almost a third, 32.1% of Wisconsin men experience intimate partner physical violence, rape, and/or stalking in their lifetimes. DV claimed 96 lives in Wisconsin in 2023. That should say not 2022. That number is different for 2022. But this is one of the highest numbers that we have seen for our state for murders related to domestic violence. Our state had around, I think, like 340 something total homicides in 2023. And so almost a third of those were directly related to domestic violence. And that number 96 includes if the perpetrator killed themselves and if children were also killed as well. We look at it as kind of that holistic number. That comes from the End Abuse Homicide Report. End Abuse Wisconsin is kind of like our sister organization, or I guess our parent organization. They're the national, excuse me, they're the statewide, not national, they're the statewide organization on domestic violence, and they produce this report every year. And that 96 number has direct correlation to gun violence in our state as well too. And the presence of a firearm in a DV situation officially has now gone up to that a person is 1,000 times more likely to be killed if there is a gun in the home. And then we also estimate that there are around 12,000 incidents of domestic violence in Dane County each year, or 33 happening per day. And in 2023, we saw around 8,000 total calls to our helpline, but on any given day of the week for the national hotlines, they're looking at 20,000 calls a day. So it's a thing, it's prevalent, it's in our community, and it's happening. Are there any questions on this slide or the previous slide at all? I always just make the note that I recognize that I just gave you some really terrible and really harrowing statistics, and then now I'm just going to move on from them. But please take care of yourselves if at any point you need to step out, and just remaking that note as well. I just also want to mention the health impact that domestic violence has on women exposed to this type of violence, that for mental health, women are twice as likely to experience depression after experiencing intimate partner violence, almost twice as likely to have alcohol use disorders, 16% more likely to have a low birth weight baby, 1.5 times more likely to acquire HIV, and 1.5 times more likely to contract syphilis, chlamydia, or gonorrhea. And 42% of women who have experienced physical or sexual violence at the hands of an intimate partner have experienced injuries as a result. And 38% of all murders of women globally were reported as being committed by their intimate partners as well. So again, impactful. All right, I want to take us through the cycle of violence. This often answers that question, well, where does this start? How does somebody get into, quote unquote, one of these relationships? It starts just like relationships without intimate partner violence start, in the honeymoon phase, right? That person's charming, they're wonderful, you like hanging out with them, you find a connection, right? For my middle schoolers and high schoolers, they say this is when you start sharing TikToks with each other. So just that honeymoon phase, you want to be around that person, you like them, right? But then that honeymoon phase transitions into the tension building phase, where that person who was wonderful, charming, amazing, you love hanging out with them, all of a sudden they start becoming more moody or more nitpicky. They start telling you, about yourself or about the little nuances of how you live your life, and to the point where you're like, what? Where is this coming from? It could be that they start using isolation tactics, right? Saying things like, I really don't think you should hang out with your friends on Saturday nights anymore if I'm not there, because I don't know what your friends are like, and I don't know if I trust them without me there. It could also be yelling that starts to happen that comes out of nowhere, withdrawing the affection that was so prevalent in the honeymoon phase, right? Maybe you go from talking all of the time to not even getting a text back. It could be substance use that wasn't there before that you didn't know about, or it could be threats or yelling or any of these things that makes somebody go, what is going on? And as part of this, the person who is starting to experience this type of violence will fawn. And when we talk about trauma responses, we include fawning in the conversation and as part of this part of the cycle of violence. So we have fight, flight, and freeze. Fawn is essentially doing anything you can to appease the threat to ensure that violence will not escalate further. So it's using people-pleasing tendencies, codependency, putting down somebody's own lack of boundaries or putting down boundaries to appease that other person. So going back to the cycle, this could look like attempting to calm that person down. It could be keeping the kids quiet if kids are starting to ask questions or notice things. It could be cooking a favorite meal, constantly cleaning the house, doing anything it can to appease that partner to ensure that violence will not escalate, but it creates the feeling of walking on eggshells around that other person. And then after the tension building phase, it transitions, it extends, but it transitions into the explosion phase. And this can be any act of physical, sexual, cognitive, emotional, financial violence, any type of violence that exists. And this is when that person experiencing this moment or this phase, they might protect themselves, right? They might fight back. They might lean into one of these other trauma responses that might, to the untrained eye, might look like erratic behavior, right? It could also be that they leave the relationship at this point. They might fight back. They might take the kids. They might get a restraining order, whatever that looks like, to lean into their own safety. But after the explosion phase, and as how cycles work, it goes right back into the honeymoon phase, where then that person says things like, oh my God, baby, I'm so sorry. I will never do that again to you. I promise I will go see this person. I promise I will go to therapy. I promise I will do better. I will clean the house more for you. Whatever that might be. It might be begging for forgiveness, promising, getting gifts, and then just promising to change, right? And that's when that person might agree to stay. They might take that person back. They might stop that legal proceeding. They might stop the restraining order process. They might set up counseling for them and their partner, right? And then there's that feeling that returns of feeling hopeful about the relationship. But then the cycle goes around and around and around. And on average, it takes a person 7 times to leave an abusive relationship before they are actually safe enough or able to leave that relationship. And that not all relationships fit neatly into this cycle of violence too. This is the important part. Domestic violence is a very unique type of trauma that exists. And we know this. We all experience trauma differently. We all cope with trauma differently. So not everybody's relationship is going to fit this exact pattern. It's also important to note that each of these phases might last a different amount of time, right? There's no time scale to this. The honeymoon phase could last 10 years and 2 kids before the tension building phase starts to build. Tension could build for a week and the explosion phase happens in 15 minutes. Each of these phases could also be followed by periods of calm. So say after the tension building phase, those 2 partners, they take a trip, great memories, they have a great time, everything is good. And the second they get to the airport, the explosion phase happens. There's no time scale to this. And this is what can trap somebody in this cycle by thinking that, oh, after maybe the 3rd or 4th explosion phase, they might just think, well, this is just our relationship. Yeah, sometimes they do that to me, but they always apologize for it. Or yeah, they always call me these really terrible names, but that's just who they are when they're mad. This is what can trap somebody in the cycle, right? And that also, the cycle repeats over and over and over again. And for some people, they might not get out of this cycle. Or even when they leave the relationship, the cycle could continue as well. Oops. Too big. So I just want to make the note, I talked about it as a unique type of trauma. Domestic violence is a unique type of trauma because it is by nature chronic. It's an ongoing traumatic experience, and where physical violence might be episodic, other forms of abuse could be ongoing. So again, that emotional, that cognitive, that financial violence, and that the perpetrator of the traumatic experience is a loved one. So most survivors will interact with their perpetrator on a regular basis. Something could happen the night before, and then the next morning they're having coffee at the dinner table with them, right? They have to sleep next to that person, or at least in the same house perhaps, right? Or if they don't live together and they're still experiencing this type of violence, they might have to see them at some point in their week, right? But I think about this kind of in comparison to a trauma such as like a car accident, right? Car accidents are absolutely traumatic. They can include, and incur some really lifelong things. However, there is a very low likelihood that you will ever see that driver of the other car again and again and again and again in your life, right? But with domestic violence, it's seeing that person who is causing you your harm or your trauma again and again and again. And it's a violation of trust, and it's a disruption to somebody's interpersonal connections and supports as well, too. Because it might not just be that it is existing as a partner and partner, but maybe after a partner experiences a violent event, the victim in the situation, maybe the abuser or the person choosing to use violence says things like, you can't tell anybody about this. You can't tell your parents about this. You can't tell your friends about this. No one will believe you. They won't believe you what happened to you. And so it's that real big disruption. It's that violation of trust as well. And that brings me to the power and control wheel. I sent this out as a resource, so you all have this. This is one of the best resources I have found, and from what I've heard from other doctors and nurses, just to have up if you are allowed to like post things in a, in a clinical room. Just as a tool for somebody to take a gander on, right? If they might be sitting there waiting for, a doctor or nurse to come into the room. But the power and control wheel exists for many different populations. This is what is called the quote unquote general power and control wheel. There's one for the LGBTQIA population. There's one for college students. There's one for teens. There's ones for the immigrant population as well too. There's just about a power and control wheel for every population that exists. So before I get into this, I just want to note the makeup, that each of these wedges of the wheel are tactics of power and control, obviously, but then it's compounded by that ring on the outside that says physical and sexual violence. And that's there to show that even if physical and sexual violence are not happening, right, or maybe it never gets to that point, the threat of it, the fear of those things is what keeps the regular use of the tactics inside of the wheel ongoing. So I'm going to start at the top and I'm going to just go through it. Bear with me. So at the top, starting with using coercion and threats, this is making and or carrying out threats to do something to hurt that other person, threatening to leave, threatening to commit suicide, threatening to report them to a government agency such as welfare, it could be ICE, it could be CPS. Making that person drop charges. So if somebody has gotten a restraining order or a no contact order, making them drop those. It could also be making them do illegal things, or just also threatening to report that person to the police as well, to the non-abusive partner. And then we have using intimidation. So making someone afraid by using looks, actions, or gestures, smashing things, destroying property, displaying pets, or abusing pets or displaying weapons. One of the biggest indicators of domestic violence happening in the home is that if there is animal abuse happening. And one of the really sad things, so just trigger warning for what I'm about to say, is that when the pandemic started in 2020, we saw some of the highest rates of animal abuse happening within homes because animals and pets were being used as power and control tactics, or abusing the pet in those home situations. And then we have using emotional abuse, so putting that person down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, making them think they're crazy, also called gaslighting as well too. Playing mind games, humiliating them, or making them feel guilty about what they are experiencing, even though it is not their fault. Using emotional abuse is also one of the most rampant forms, if not the most rampant form of abuse that exists, because it is the hardest to quote unquote prove in a legal setting. And then we have using isolation, so controlling what they do, who they see, who they talk to, what they read, what they watch, where they go, limiting that outside involvement, and then using jealousy, and I would also say using safety to justify those actions. And that could absolutely manifest in a healthcare setting when the partner asks to come into the room with them, right? And then all of a sudden, they're saying things like, oh, it's not that bad. It's not that serious. I know, I got to do a better job of making our home situation safe, right? And so it's using that power and control in that setting as well too, and isolating that person further. And then that also goes along with minimizing, denying, and blaming. So making light of the abuse and not taking concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting the responsibility for abusive behavior, and saying that the other person did something to cause what is happening to them. Then we have using children, so making somebody feel guilty about the children if they're starting to see things or hear things. It could be using the children to relay messages from the abusive parent to the non-abusive parent. It could also be using visitation or custody exchange or placement exchange to harass another person. And that if somebody has a no contact order, right, and that one partner is not allowed to see the other partner, but say, on Tuesdays at Pick and Save, they exchange the kiddo, maybe Tuesdays at Pick and Save is the only time when that person has to use power and control tactics on their partner, right? So using visitation, using custody exchange as a means of harassment. It could also be threatening to take the children away or threatening to call CPS on the non-abusive parent as well. And then we have using male privilege. And I just want to pause on this before I get into it. I have contacted the people who have made this general wheel here because, we have seen now in 2024, 2023, the highest rates of violence for men, right? And I had a conversation with the person or with the group that created this wheel, and they said, well, yes, and in this country, we exist under a patriarchy, right? There are privileges afforded to men that are not afforded to women. But for the sake of the conversation today, I am just going to name this as using privilege because like on the LGBTQIA wheel, even on the teen wheel, this is just using privilege. And I don't want to create a situation or environment of blame or shame for anybody in this space that identifies as male as well. So using privilege is just using any part of your identity to hold privilege over that other person or that other partner. But it could look like treating that person like a servant or making all of the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle or the master of the resources, and then being the one to define the roles of the relationship as well too. I do this, you do that, that's how it is. And if there's any question on it, another one of these tactics on the wheel might be used. And then we have using economic abuse, another really rampant form of abuse, and that's preventing somebody from getting or keeping a job, making them ask for money, making them or giving an allowance or establishing an allowance. It could also be taking the money without that person knowing, not letting them know about or have access to family income, starting accounts in somebody's name when they do not know about it, using somebody's social security number without their knowledge. It could also be hiding car keys in the morning so that somebody gets to work late and lost productivity, lost wages. Or it could be keeping somebody up late in the middle of the night, in a fight. So again, they have sabotaged productivity or sabotaged, performance the next day, whether it be on a test or at work or anything. Woo, okay. Are you all with me? Cool. Any questions on the wheel? Look at that. And then there is a bonus slice, as I call it, and that is digital abuse. And this is one of the things that we are starting to see happen so much more often, especially with like the younger, like teen to college age population. Just as we're on our phones more, right? We're using, these digital devices. I have my phone literally right here. But digital abuse, the one caveat I want to make about it is that some of these things as they exist are not inherently abusive, right? But when it has or contains power and control or the possibility of violence happening as a result of doing or not doing one of these actions, that's when it becomes digitally abusive. So that could be monitoring someone's communication, demanding photos, videos, calls, whatever that might be in a sexual nature, excessively texting somebody so that they can't use their phone, or constantly calling somebody over and over and over again so that they can't just use their phone or use the functions of their phone. It could be hacking, and I have to change this. Whenever I see hacking, I think of like, I'm in, but I think about hacking as like going into somebody's DMs or their phone or their device without their knowledge, right? Or demanding that they have access to any one of those things. It could also be posting private images or messages or screenshots onto like a social media platform or just in a public setting, or just sending them to somebody's social support network as well. And then there's also demanding check-ins. So that could be over the phone, it could be text, it could be FaceTime calls, especially at times when somebody is not able to. So I think about like somebody goes to a movie, right? And then their partner is constantly calling, texting, FaceTiming them to make sure they're actually where they're supposed to be, right? And then there's tracking location, which I believe inherently as it exists is not a bad thing, right? The ability for all of us to have GPS locations is neither here nor there, but I have my location turned on for everybody in my life because I see it as a safety thing. If I am ever in a dangerous situation, I want my dad to know where I am, right? But if it is used as a means of power and control or controlling or tracking somebody's movements or what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, is again when it becomes abusive. So saying something like, for instance, this presentation ends at 8:20 and you're still at the Bulls Auditorium. Why haven't you left yet? It's 8:30. Why are you still there? Who are you talking to? It could sound like, before you came over to my house today, you made a stop at Quick Trip. What were you doing at Quick Trip? Why didn't you get me anything? So it's really controlling somebody's movements. And then lastly, posting cruel things or untrue things about a partner, especially on a social media platform as well. Any questions on this? We're getting through it. And I'm doing good on time too. So I want to talk about barriers next as the next part of this presentation. When I talk about barriers, these often also answer that question, well, why didn't somebody leave? That is the number one question that domestic violence victims and survivors are asked constantly. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you notice this sooner? Why didn't you just get out the first time, right? Going back to that cycle of violence. Why didn't you leave after the first time the explosion phase happened? And it's because of all of these reasons on the list here. So to start at the top, emotional attachment and love for partner. This is one of the most valid reasons why somebody is not going to leave their relationship. They love them, right? That relationship started somewhere. Maybe that honeymoon phase did last 20 years and 3 kids, right? Before tension even started to build. That love was there for that partner, and they might not be ready to leave that. They also might not be ready to see that partner encounter like a system like law enforcement, right? Or might not want to take them through the legal system as well too, because they have love or admiration for that person. It could be fear for own safety or safety of children or other family members or pets as well. It could be denial or disbelief that the abuse is even happening, hoping for change. Again, going back to that cycle of violence. When it returns to the honeymoon phase, there's that feeling or that sense of feeling hopeful again about the relationship. It could also be distrust in authorities. And I want to pause on this one just for a quick second. In Wisconsin, we have what's called the mandatory arrest law, which means that if two officers respond to a domestic's call or a domestic situation, one person has to be taken into custody. Now, if police officers are not well versed in trauma-informed care, in how trauma manifests, or in domestic violence, we absolutely see at days the victim being the person that gets taken into custody. Because if we have two partners in maybe, let's say, a physical violence altercation, right? And one person who is choosing to use violence inflicts severe violence on their partner, and that partner is acting in one of those trauma responses, maybe they're in the fight trauma response, right? Maybe they're in the flight trauma response. And then when the officer shows up to that scene and that person might look like they're acting erratically, or maybe they're trying to cuss out the cop, right? Or fight the cop. And then the person who chose to use violence says, "Yes, officer. How can I help you, officer? I know this person is acting so crazy. Please take my story because I'm the one who can give you the real and honest truth about what's happening here." That cop might take that victim into custody. And we do see that at days. It's one of the things our legal system helps with. But distrust in authorities could also look like not wanting to tell your coworkers, not wanting to tell your boss, because then what if your boss tells you that you have to go to the employee assistance program? Or maybe it's a note in the file, or maybe now your coworkers are afraid, if your partner shows up to work, or maybe they're afraid seeing you get picked up by them, right? And distrust in authorities could also look like teens not wanting to reach out, period, to anybody, especially if it's a safe adult at their school, because all adults that work at schools are mandated reporters, and they might not want to disclose to those safe adults because they don't want it to be elevated in any capacity. We also have shame and embarrassment that the abuse has happened to them, or feeling like, oh, my situation is so big, it is so dire, nobody will understand. It could be depression, stress, isolation, PTSD, anxiety, any of these real mental health costs that come as a result of experiencing trauma. It could be financial resources dependent, so income, housing, employment, transportation. And then we have institutional or intersectional oppressions as well too. So if one of those partners was justice system involved before, if there's a history of substance use with one of the partners, or if somebody's immigration status is at play as well too. A couple of years ago, when we had that increased ICE presence in Madison, we saw a number of our legal clients not wanting to go to the courthouse for fear that they might be detained by going to the courthouse. And we had to do a high level of advocacy and bringing more people from our organization to go to the courthouse with them to let them know that that would not happen, right? Because they were just wanting a restraining order. And then also too, on the right side of the screen here, all of these tweets were from a national campaign called the #WhyIStayed campaign. It was on Twitter a couple of years before Me Too really took off, but it was started by the woman with the top tweet on the screen here, Beverly Gooden, who's a Black woman activist, I believe out of New York. And she took to Twitter and just said he would change. He promised it was the last time. I believed him and he lied. And then #WhyIStayed. And then it became this national movement on Twitter of people from all demographics sharing what kept them in that relationship as well. So now we get to transition into the fun part. Actually, let me go back. Any questions? Alrighty. So I like to talk about what is your role for this topic, for this space. Number one, that you do not need to be a social worker. You don't need to be an expert on domestic violence just to be a safe and supportive person that might be coming to you. Your role is to increase safety and decrease that isolation by providing just a safe space, just looking at like a clinic space, right? That is a safe space for someone to come and talk. You are automatically decreasing isolation just by existing, just by having that space. You also cannot save anyone from the abuse. And this is a really hard thing. This is hard for me to understand when I first came to this work, is that we will not save people from what they're experiencing, but you can support them. You can be that open door for them as many times as they might need to reach out to you. And you can't prescribe safety. That person might be in that clinic setting or in that room for a 15-minute or 50-minute even appointment, but we can't guarantee that the second they leave that room that they're going to be safe. We can't prescribe, no matter how much we safety plan with them, no matter how much we put into, practice for them, we can't guarantee that they're going to be safe when they leave our space. And that is a hard thing to understand, but it's also validating because it takes a little bit of weight off of your shoulders to not feel like it is solely your responsibility. We have a community of people that do exist, such as days, to help people as much as you might need the help, as much as that client or that patient might need the help. And it can be this really multifaceted community approach that doesn't land only on you. And that you make a difference in this as well too. So people who disclose to their healthcare provider were far more likely to use an intervention, report fewer threats of violence and assaults, and fewer poor pregnancy outcomes as well too, just by disclosing, just by somebody talking with their healthcare provider. So what can we do? What can you all do? This is my favorite part of the conversation too. I think about it as kind of like this little formula of screening, validating, documenting, and referring. And so before we jump into the formula, some of the barriers that I have heard from healthcare providers that they face when screening or when in that moment when they're asking about intimate partner violence, or even just that feeling of like, I don't know how to ask the question in this space, is number one, the comfort level, right? We all might feel like that's an unspoken thing in that moment, in that room. And it might be uncomfortable just to ask, right? You might feel like you're breaching somebody's like confidentiality or safety, right? That's absolutely a real thing. There could also be feelings of frustration with patients when they do not follow a plan of care, right? Say they disclose to you in that moment and you call days together and then that person leaves and you see as they're leaving the clinic, they get into the car with their partner, right? That can be like, oh, we just talked about this, or, oh, we just had this conversation. That can be really, really hard as well. It could also be not knowing what to do about positive disclosures of abuse, right? I had a doctor tell me once that the first time they were in a setting with a patient and that patient disclosed severe physical violence from their partner, they felt like they were also like got the wind knocked out of them because they had in that moment, we can do all of these trainings, you can go through any amount of schooling as possible, right? But still in that moment, having that where somebody says, yes, and this is because of my partner, it can feel like the wind is knocked out of you. And so not knowing what to do when that happens, and also could be lack of time too. I think about like a 20-minute appointment, and in that 20 minutes, somebody is there just for like a brief routine checkup. Maybe they just need to ask a question to their doctor, right? But in that last 2 minutes of that appointment, they bring up domestic violence or they disclose domestic violence, and all of a sudden, that person or that doctor, that nurse has to get to the next room, has to get to the next patient. That can also be a really big barrier as well too. So I bring all of these into this conversation just to validate that these are very, very real things that healthcare providers experience. But hopefully some of the parts of this formula can help. So when we talk about screening, I always say always, 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 let me say it again, always screen patients alone. Even if that partner is in the room, even if that partner is telling you that they have to be there, you can just say, hey, it's part of the protocol and part of the policy for this place that I have to ask some of these questions to the primary patient alone. And if that person puts up any fight, I have had a doctor tell me that that's when you get to lean into kind of the natural power you hold in that moment of the, ushering them up, ushering them out, and saying, we'll grab you in a second when these questions wrap up, or when this conversation wraps up, just so again, that person gets a chance to be screened alone. And if at that third point of contact, that partner is still not leaving the room, do not screen. And do not screen in that moment, do not screen with them there. Maybe it looks like a follow-up call to say, hey, I just have some additional questions for you when you know that partner is not going to be there. Present those questions as routine, common, and normal. You are not singling them out. Even if it is the only person in that day that you are screening, make sure that that person doesn't know that they are the only person you are screening. But just saying, hey, I ask everybody these questions, or everybody that comes into my office, I ask these questions to them. And then please use a professional interpreter if necessary. I say professional because sometimes what we have seen is that somebody might bring a family member or somebody might bring a kiddo, and having to have that family member, or that kiddo interpret what is happening. They might be not knowing what's going on, and it might be the first time they're hearing their parent, their loved one talk about the abuse that is happening. Or it could be too that some of the words that exist around domestic violence in other languages might not exist, right? So it might be hard. There might be that just natural language barrier. So please use a professional interpreter if necessary. We use the language line at Days. It's a great phone service in the moment. Also, the Interpreters Co-op also exists here in Madison too, and they, I believe, can come on site with people. And then lastly, discuss mandatory reporting if there are mandatory reporting laws that you have that you hold. I was told at one point that it could look different per every like hospital or clinic. So if that is something to be considered for somebody's safety or having to elevate what might be happening to them, make sure you discuss that transparently with that client or with that person, I should say. And then talking about screening tools. So screening tools do vary, but the following ones on this list were found by the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force to show the most sensitivity and specificity around domestic violence. So the HITS tool, the OVAT tool, the STAT tool, the HARC tool, and the WAST tool as well. Most of these are just Likert scale questions. I know that one of them that exists only has 2 questions, like, do you feel safe at home? Are you experiencing violence from your partner? But one of the ones that we are starting to include in the conversation is from this organization called Futures Without Violence. And this is the CUES document. So this is confidentiality, universal education and empowerment, and then support as well too. And on this website, ipvhealth.org, it is a toolkit that has so many resources. It's like a treasure trove of resources for healthcare providers on helping to screen, ask the question on domestic violence, and they also have a bunch of other trainings on that website as well too. It's a beautiful, beautiful resource that exists. And I did send out a copy of this as part of like the resources I sent to Christy as well too, if you want to look at it more. All right. So then when we get into affirming and validating, this helps with that like either comfort levels or that fear of not knowing, you know, what's going to happen after you ask the question. I always just lean into affirming and validating when I'm at a loss for words, right? When that feeling of like, oh, I had the wind knocked out of me, right? That could be, thank you for telling me. I'm very glad you told me. I care about you. I'm concerned about you. Any one of these numbers on this list here, any one of these statements on this list. But lastly, that last one with all of the stars by it, we can call days together if you would like. And that can look like in the moment, you can absolutely call us and say, hey, I am so-and-so. I have a patient here with me right now. And they just disclosed to me that they have domestic violence and they have some questions for you, or they're curious about your services. The only thing that we need is that, say in that moment, somebody would like to use our services, we need a verbal yes. We need verbal consent from them in that moment and not on your behalf as the provider. And as well, say that person leaves your office or that setting, and then you want to call us back and like follow up on that patient. And so you call us and say, hey, you know, I was the doctor that just called, or I was the nurse that just called with my patient, and I want to follow up on this person and I want to talk more about them. You will receive on our end, we can't confirm or deny that that person has ever called us or used our services, unless there is a release of information in ROI that is signed on our end, and that has to be prompted by that patient or by that client as well too. So I know that can be frustrating, but it's again, just for the safety and confidentiality of everybody who uses our services. And then to talk about documenting. So please document any visible signs of abuse by noting the injury type, the size, the degree of healing. If a patient tells you about abuse, make general notes about what they say, and set off patient's own words in quotation marks or use phrases such as patient states or patient reports. But we want to get away from using judgmental language or that language that could introduce what's the word I'm looking for? Like not a positive disclosure, I guess. So like instead of saying patient claims, patient states, instead of saying patient alleges, patient reports. That way that again, if these records are subpoenaed in any way for a court case, it is not introducing doubt into that situation. It's also describing the patient's demeanor as they are talking about the abuse as well too, and this can be very, very important. One of our legal representatives said that there was absolutely no evidence that a person had for their case but the records that their doctor kept that were subpoenaed. And so having that demeanor that like, as they were talking about the physical violence episode that that they experienced, they were shaking the entire time that they were telling me this, right? So talking about those very real demeanor parts of that too. Record the time of day the patient is examined, and if possible, indicate how much time has passed since the abuse occurred. This also really speaks to like strangulation. If strangulation was ever a part of that conversation, strangulation is a big, big red flag. And there is the National Strangulation Training Institute, I believe, that talks about all of the nuances on why strangulation is so important and why we should consider it as like a very big safety concern. Also, consider the possibilities or the options for cloaking notes or adding additional confidential notes in patient records. I have only seen this, I believe, on like the Epic systems. There is a possibility to cloak a note on MyChart, which means that it is not seen if somebody accesses that MyChart, but it can be seen by the person who has access to the MyChart. So for example, the doctor, the nurse, whoever has access would be able to see it, and the patient. But one of the considerations for this is that if the partner can see all notes or has access to that MyChart, they could absolutely call and request that all notes be read, even if one of the notes is cloaked. But talk with your supervisor and talk with like any other folks that exist at your specific clinic site or your hospital location on what cloaking notes looks like. I know for some doctors, they have told me that like domestic violence is absolutely always a reason that they would cloak notes, but that you also might need to get additional approval in order to do so on those certain software systems. And then also, as I mentioned, the confidential records you note may be the only records that exist of the abuse, right? Somebody might not tell a single person, but their doctor, what is happening to them, or the nurse that they see too. Any questions on this part? Or does anybody want to clarify the cloaking notes aspect either? Or has anybody seen that before? All right, cool. And I also know we only have a couple minutes left here, so I'm about to wrap up. But referring, this is a really, really big part of this too. Understand that leaving is not always the safest choice. It actually might be the most dangerous time that someone will experience. Trust the victim or survivor and encourage them to trust themselves. They know their situation the best. They know their safety the best as well. Share your safety concerns and lethality risks. It means a lot when it comes from a person in like who's a healthcare professional to say, hey, I am worried about your safety. Identify their strengths and support systems and refer and connect them to community resources. This is a really easy little sentence to say. I am not an expert in domestic violence, but here's the number of people that are. All of their services are completely free and confidential, and you can call this number or text us to get some support. And if somebody says no, leave the door open. And if not a door, maybe a window. So just saying, thanks for letting me talk to you about this. If you ever have questions for yourself or for a friend, I am always available, or I know of some resources that exist as well. And then also too, how to refer to us. All referrals have to come through our 24/7 helpline. Somebody could absolutely text us and ask for services. We just need to make sure that they call us to give us that verbal consent, that verbal yes that they would like services, and then they can go back to the texting conversation if that's most comfortable. And then again, we need clients present during the call, not on their behalf. But you all can absolutely call us just to ask general questions, hypothetical questions, talk to one of our advocates. Even if you want to talk to me, you can always call our helpline as well. And then the release of information on the ROI, we need that on our day's end. We have a very specific one that is time limited and fully consent based. So that's why we have to have one that is ours, not just one that exists for like another organization or on somebody else's behalf. And lastly, these are more so just tips for friends and loved ones, but they also can apply to anybody who we encounter who might be experiencing intimate or domestic violence. Listening without judgment, believing their story, sharing your concern for their safety, supporting their decisions, remembering that leaving is not always the safest choice, providing resources when you know about them, and remembering that you don't have to be an expert on this, right? It goes such a long way to say to somebody, you know, I will be here for you for this. I will be here for you if you have any questions. And you don't have to have all of those answers, right, in that moment. You all can call us whenever you want or text us too. And then these are just some other resources I wanted to include for you all. Some local Wisconsin resources, some Dane County resources, and then some national resources as well too. And then these are all of the databases for where most of our statistics and most of the resources from this presentation have come from. And then lastly, this is my information. I am on my email as much as I am on my phone, and that is all of the time. So please, please, please reach out to me directly if you have any questions, if you want to talk more, or if you want to set up a meeting. I love also getting coffee too. So please, please, please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for your time today. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. It's almost Friday. So yay, have a great one.